He earned his PhD from Princeton and has taught as professor of American Religious History at Columbia for 25 years before becoming the Mandel Family Professor at Dartmouth in 2012. He's been a visiting professor at Princeton, Yale, Northwestern, Emory, and he's been in the Columbia University School of Journalism, and he also writes frequently for the Valley News as well as many national publications. He's written more than about a dozen books. Yes.
Something.
And he was here last June to talk about Jimmy Carter and his biography on him. Tonight he's here because this book has been reissued after 25 years. Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America. I'm sure you're prepared to tell us why it's reissued after 25 years. And maybe speculate on the future of fundamentalists' influence in politics, particularly. But even the 25-year-old stuff, Chapter 8 from a campaign journal in the 1988 caucuses in Iowa. Just a few quotes to make you pique your interest. One vote in a caucus might turn a caucus into a pro-life issue, says the president of the Iowa Right to Life Committee. A pastor from a Lutheran church, this is his quote, "Christ instructs us to take part in the government in which we live." And he goes on to express his concern that mainline Christians may, by non-involvement, give way to more fervent fundamentalists. And you described the First Federated Church, the television floodlights, and there's a quote there, righteousness over unrighteousness. But perhaps the most memorable quote is, "It's time now to pick up my skillet and my rolling pin and charge." Please.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate this. I'm happy to keep this. I've been told to keep it shorter than last time, so I'll try to compress my remarks a little bit. This book, stunning new book. It's actually been in print continuously for 25 years, which for an academic book is a tad unusual. This is the 5th edition of the book. Let me say a little bit about the origins of the book. In the mid-1980s, I started teaching at Columbia in 1985, and I'm really trained as a colonial historian, so this was not my field really at all. And I remember very clearly, as I'm sure many of you do as well, this is when all the televangelist scandals were breaking. This is when Jim Baker had a tryst with, again, you can't make this up, with a church secretary from Long Island down in his PTL headquarters area there, and used money from the ministry to pay hush money, essentially, to this woman, Jessica Hahn. This is when Jimmy Swaggart had these voyeuristic liaisons with prostitutes in Louisiana motel rooms. And then, perhaps most memorably, when Oral Roberts declared that God had effectively taken him hostage and would take Oral Roberts home, presumably up to heaven, unless God's people ponied up something like $4.5 million. And it was great fun. I kind of enjoyed it. I'd never cared for the televangelist myself. And it was a lot of media attention that was finally being directed toward evangelicals. And after I kind of enjoyed that for a little while, I became uneasy with the tone of media coverage of evangelicals. And I'll define them for you here in a minute. Because the media seemed to think that all evangelicals were either gullible or the moral equivalent of Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart. And having grown up in that world, I thought I could offer a little bit different perspective. So I cooked up this crazy idea, and in fact my department chair said that I would be committing professional suicide if I wrote this book. I cooked up this crazy idea to travel around the country and visit various groups of evangelicals at the grassroots and try to present a more textured, complicated portrait of a movement that is very often portrayed as monolithic and without distinction. And so what emerged was the first edition of this book, coming out in June of 1989, called Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, a journey into the evangelical subculture in America. I have long been fascinated by the genre of travel literature in America, Travels with Charlie, and particularly William Least Heat Moon's travel around America called Blue Highways, and that probably was the most immediate inspiration for this book, although obviously it's a very different book from what he wrote. So before I talk about some of the people that I wrote about, some of the places I visited, let me define for you evangelical. I use a three-part definition for it. An evangelical is somebody who believes that the Bible is God's revelation to humanity, and so it should be taken seriously, if not interpreted literally, although I've since argued that evangelicals engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism. We see that today in politics, I think especially, where evangelicals kind of go through and cherry pick certain passages from the Bible and say, you know, the Bible says this, and then they ignore other things that the Bible says, including caring for the poor and things like that. But an evangelical will understand the Bible as being divinely inspired in God's revelation to humanity. On the basis of that, the second characteristic of an evangelical is someone who believes in the centrality of a conversion experience or a born-again experience. And the term born-again appears in the 3rd chapter of St. John in the New Testament. And some of you perhaps remember this, when Jesus, who is a Jewish leader, Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night and asks Jesus how he can be admitted into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus replies, "You must be born again." Some versions, some translations have it as born from above, but the term born again has been picked up by evangelicals to describe a conversion experience. And most evangelicals will be able to be quite specific about this. Sorry, I taught today and I'm kind of tired, so I'm trying to get a hold of myself. We'll be able to recount the time, the date, and the circumstances surrounding their born again moment. You know, I was converted, or I was born again in June of 1982, and I had a medical issue that was threatening to my life, and my neighbor in the next bed next to me in the hospital directed me toward the Bible, and I read the Bible, and I was born again at that moment. And for evangelicals, this is a transformative experience, very often accompanied by emotion, but not always. Billy Graham worried, for example, for a long time that his born-again experience back in 1934 was not real because he was not terribly emotional, as others were at that same venue. But this is a transformative moment that signals the difference between heaven and hell, to put it in crass terms, but turning away from sin towards salvation, from unrighteousness to righteousness, and so forth. And the third general characteristic about evangelicals is that they believe in the mandate to evangelize, or to bring others into the faith. A less kind word for that probably would be to proselytize others and bring them into the faith. And this they see as coming out of Jesus' command at the end of the Gospel of Mark: go into all the world, preach the gospel, baptize them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. My observation over the last 50 years or so is that evangelicals talk about doing that last thing rather than more than they actually do it. That is, they tend to hire professionals to do it for them, missionaries or evangelists, or a lot of the mega churches will have a visitation minister or an outreach minister or someone of that sort. But at least ostensibly, an evangelical will claim the responsibility for evangelizing or bringing others into the faith. So with that kind of general, broad definition of evangelical, one of the things that I tried to do was to show that within that larger movement, which by the way makes up something like 40% of the U.S. population, it's a huge movement, Within that larger umbrella, there are several different strains, and let me try to describe some of those for you. Probably the first one to start with would be the holiness movement. The holiness movement is really a 19th century movement concerned about individual probity and disciplined lifestyle, a spiritual lifestyle. You find holiness people who will not be ostentatious in their dress, for example, particularly for women. Many holiness groups believe that women should never cut their hair ever in their entire lifetime. And so you go to holiness gatherings and you see all these very, very, really interesting hairdos where they're trying to keep their hair that way. Women won't wear jewelry or cosmetics because they believe that that's too ostentatious, and they're trying to cultivate a very disciplined spiritual lifestyle. Out of the holiness movement comes another movement in the early part of the 20th century. In fact, New Year's Day, the first day of the century, New Year's Day 1901, in Topeka, Kansas, there's a revival of Pentecostalism. And that derives from the second chapter of Acts, when the Holy Spirit comes down upon the early Christians and they begin speaking in tongues, speaking in an unknown language under the influence of the Holy Spirit. Well, this happens in Topeka, Kansas on New Year's Day 1901 at a place called Bethel Bible College. And what comes out of that movement is the Pentecostal movement, especially in Los Angeles at the Azusa Street Mission on 312 Azusa Street beginning in April of 1906. And then that movement spreads throughout North America and around the world by way of missionaries. Today, for example, down in Latin America, also in many parts of Africa, it's Pentecostalism that is really taking hold, and it really is making a huge difference in the lives of a lot of people. It's become the new theology of the people in Latin America, displacing Latin liberation theology. Another variant of evangelicalism would be fundamentalism. Fundamentalists take their name from a series of pamphlets that were published between 1910 and 1915 called the Fundamentals. Those who subscribed to these very conservative doctrines came to be known as fundamentalists. The term has since been enlarged to talk about Islamic fundamentalists or Jewish fundamentalists or Hindu fundamentalists or even Buddhist fundamentalists. But the term properly belongs to American religious history and to this group that forms itself around this series of pamphlets published between 1910 and 1915. Some people ask, what's the difference between an evangelical and a fundamentalist? Jerry Falwell once said, and he was right about this one, he wasn't right about a whole lot of things, but this one he was right about. A fundamentalist is an evangelical who's mad about something. And it's a pretty good definition because it's more a matter of temperament than it is theology. There's a militancy to fundamentalism that you don't see very often with evangelicals. Other variations, you could go on, but let me just do a couple more. One would be a group called the New Evangelicals, so-called New Evangelicals, or the Neo-Evangelicals. These would be people who would be identified with Billy Graham. That is, very ironic in their approach to others. Fundamentalists, by the way, believe that Billy Graham is a flaming liberal because Billy Graham, in his Madison Square Garden crusade in 1957, cooperated with the New York Ministerial Alliance, which included more theologically liberal Protestant ministers. And they have never forgiven him for doing that. A bit of an anecdote here. In the early 90s, I was doing a documentary on Billy Graham for PBS, and I wanted to interview one of these fundamentalists who thinks that Billy Graham is a flaming liberal, because I thought it'd be kind of fun to put it in there. So I wrote to Bob Jones Jr. down at Bob Jones University, and I thought he might be interested because Graham actually was a student briefly at Bob Jones, at that time, college, before Graham dropped out and went somewhere else, and eventually to Wheaton College. So I wrote to Bob Jones Jr. and I asked if he would be willing to be interviewed, and I got a letter back, which is in my file somewhere. It says very, very tersely, he says, I don't know how to tell you I haven't the slightest interest in talking about Billy Graham other than to say what I've just said, yours sincerely. And so I tried, that having failed, I tried with Carl McIntyre, who was, just died not too long ago actually, was one of the most famous fundamentalists of the 20th century. And in my pitch to Carl McIntyre, I made the mistake of saying this was a documentary for PBS, whereupon he launched into a 20-minute tirade about how PBS was a communist front and all this. And so I never got my interview with a fundamentalist. But fundamentalists don't like Billy Graham. They especially don't like Pentecostals, but that's a whole other question. And then you have more recently, Latino, Hispanic, evangelicals. In fact, the new chapter that I added to this book is about Latino Pentecostals. And they, I think, are going to have a huge effect on the shape and character of evangelicalism in the 21st century. Let me just kind of go back and talk about a few of the places I visited and some of the things that I wrote about. One of the places I visited was Calvary Chapel in Southern California, Costa Mesa, California. This is really the font of the Jesus movement in the early 1970s when Chuck Smith, the pastor of that church, who just died actually about a year ago, began to preach to hippies, the counterculture people who were hanging out in Huntington Beach and other places in Southern California. He brought them in by the thousands. And many of them converted to evangelical Christianity. Many of them professed to miraculous and instantaneous healing from drug dependency and other addictions. And this has become a very, very large movement called Calvary Chapel. I'm not sure if there's one around here or not. I should know this. I guess I don't yet, because I'm still relatively new in these parts. But Calvary Chapel has become its own denomination with churches really all over the world that peddle this very easy kind of lilting music and worship, and that's followed up generally by a sermon that tends to be rather stern from Chuck Smith or one of the pastors, whoever happens to be the pastor at any given Calvary Chapel. But there I got a sense of the Jesus movement in the early 70s. Fascinating to be with people, and I went down with them to Newport Beach when they were going on to the beach and witnessing to people, trying to bring them into the faith there at Calvary Chapel. Another place I visited was, what do I want to talk about next? Fundamentalist Bible Camp in the Adirondack Mountains, Scroon Lake, New York. I don't know if any folks know that area. A man by the name of Jack Wyrtzen started a Bible camp up there in the 1940s, about the same time that the expansion of automobile travel made those resort areas kind of obsolete for people coming from New York on the train lines and so forth. And there I was able to look at evangelical adolescents trying to appropriate their parents' faith for themselves. And for me, that was a very personal chapel because I remembered very often going to Bible camp myself, trying to appropriate my parents' faith for myself and having difficulty doing that. For an evangelical, one of the most important tasks that you have is to pass the faith along from one generation to the next. But that's a problem that bedevils people of all religions, I think. It's very, very difficult to do that, especially in a tradition that prizes this conversion experience that I described earlier. And what happens is that you have parents who perhaps were brought into the faith through Calvary Chapel or some sort of similar organization, and of course being suddenly good Christian people, responsible parents and so forth, they want nothing more than to bring their children into the faith as well. So what do? You send them to Sunday school, you pray with them, you read the Bible with them, you send them to Bible camp in the summertime and so forth, but then you still expect them to have the same sort of dramatic conversion experience that they had had, that the parents had had. And they can't, the children can't, and it's very difficult for them because any conversion that they have is merely a kind of ratification of the lifestyle into which they had been socialized all of their lives. And so what I was writing about and what I remembered very clearly from my own adolescence was going to Bible camp every summer and then having that religious moment again, surrounded by everybody who believes as you do and so forth, and making this resolve to go back to my high school and be a good Christian and carry my Bible to school and all this stuff. And then going back to Bible camp again the following year, and then kind of confessing that it hadn't worked out. I've received more mail about that chapter than anything else I've ever written. I still get letters about this 25 years later from people saying, "You told my story. That's exactly my experience." And very often there's an overtone, a very strong overtone of nostalgia. I want to have that childhood faith. I want to be able to claim that for myself, even many years later as an adult. So that chapter has gotten a lot of attention. Actually, it was also picked up in the Norton Anthology, the 9th edition. I don't know if it's been in subsequent editions, but it's had a fairly wide readership. Other places, a camp meeting down in Florida. Camp meetings were very popular in the early part of the 19th century when people from all around or from a wide geographical area would come and listen to preaching, sing hymns and so forth, and come away, many of them newly converted Christians, evangelical Christians, although critics at the time claimed that more souls were conceived than converted in these gatherings. Nevertheless, it became a fixture in the frontier in the early part of the 19th century. This tradition of camp meetings continues to this day. You can visit camp meetings almost anywhere in the country where you have this emphasis on holy living. This is where you see women with strange hairstyles and so forth, because these are holiness people trying to keep this alive. Around here, the best example, well, the closest example would be Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard, which is an old-fashioned 19th century Methodist holiness camp meeting. Ocean Grove, New Jersey is probably equally famous, if not more famous, as a place where the camp meeting tradition is still very much around, very much alive on the Jersey Shore. Other places, I'm trying to remember now some of the places Valdosta, Georgia, thank you. I think one of the most fascinating places that I wrote about came about with, there was just a paragraph explanation in the New York Times on Sunday on what used to be the religion page. And it was a note indicating that there was an evangelical, actually a Pentecostal congregation in Valdosta, Georgia, that was going to be received en masse into the Episcopal Church. Ever since 1959, there has been a movement within the Episcopal Church toward Pentecostalism, beginning out in Van Nuys, California, under the rectorship of a man named Dennis Bennett. And Dennis Bennett, who was an Episcopal priest, obviously, began having these spiritual experiences, speaking in tongues and this sort of thing. And he tried to relate that to his parish. And to say the least, the bishop was not amused by this, and Bennett was eventually kicked out of the diocese, whereupon one of the parishioners said to a reporter from Time magazine, "Thank God," he said, "we're Episcopalians, not a bunch of wild-eyed hillbillies." And they did away with that. Well, Bennett went on to St. Luke's Episcopal Parish up in Seattle and brought the whole idea of Pentecostal enthusiasm within the rubric of the Episcopal Church to that parish, and revived what was a dormant congregation into a real outpost for Pentecostal enthusiasm. So that has been replicated at other places and other parishes around the country. But I'd never before seen the opposite, that is a Pentecostal congregation wanting to become Episcopalian. And so I said, I got to see this. So I made arrangements to go down and to witness this event on Easter Sunday 1990, when 220 members of a Pentecostal congregation became Episcopalians. There were 5 Episcopal bishops receiving them into the church, all in the midst of some of the most enthusiastic singing and swaying and arms upraised in the Pentecostal gesture of openness to the Holy Spirit. And it may have been the most remarkable religious experience I've ever seen, that congregation. And the challenge was, well, let me go back a little bit, because you seem to be interested. I'm trying to read faces as I go here, and you seem to be interested, so let me say a little bit more about this. What happened was that there was an Assembly of God in Valdosta, Evangel Assembly of God, and the pastor, a man by the name of James White, they call him, was heading toward retirement, and he wanted to kind of turn the church, it was a thriving, a large congregation, turn the church over to his son, Stan White. And so he was starting to move to kind of relinquish some control. Well, Stan White at the same time started reading church history, of all things, right? Started reading ancient church fathers, started reading liturgical books like the Book of Common Prayer and other things. And so he he became very intrigued by this, and he started incorporating elements of a liturgical service into this Assembly of God congregation. Well, that's just unheard of. I mean, they had processions and recessions, actually, which I'm sure the only Assembly of God church ever to have this sort of thing. And he just felt that he wanted to connect with the historic church. He wanted to understand church history, what had gone on before, and the creeds, the Nicene Creed and so forth, which Pentecostals don't say the Nicene Creed. That's just not part of it. That's not what they do. And so he started introducing these things, and then he finally said, I think I need to become an Episcopalian. And he thought that the gig would be up at that point when he announced that to the congregation. And for some folks in the congregation said, yeah, you're right, we don't want to do that. But a good number of that congregation said, yeah, we want to go with you. So they started this new church, and they, again, started incorporating all these things. One thing led to another, and then they all became Episcopalians. It was really quite extraordinary. And for the 25th anniversary edition, what I did was add an afterword, bringing up to date some of the people and places that I wrote about in earlier editions of this. And so I went down to Valdosta and visited with Stan White and this congregation. And they're still going strong, still blending Pentecostal enthusiasm with the rubric of the Book of Common Prayer, and it's really quite remarkable, quite a remarkable place.
What was the request for the Indian reservation?
Indian reservation. Okay, Indian reservation. This is Episcopalian also, which underscores the fact that there are evangelical Episcopalians. I want to make that point rather emphatically. I wanted to go to an Indian reservation, so I went to Standing Rock Indian Reservation, which straddles North and South Dakota. The parish there is Fort Yates, North Dakota. And I was able to visit with a pastor of a Pentecostal congregation there, a man by the name of John Bush, but then also I spent time with the rector of the Episcopal parish, a man by the name of Innocent Goodhouse. Wonderful, and a wonderful, lovely guy. And what he was trying to do was to show the commonalities between the Christian faith and native traditions. And so the chapter talks about that at some length. At the same time, this John Bush says, nothing doing. If you become a Christian, if you become an evangelical, you have to give up all these native superstitions. and so forth. And so the contrast, I think, is rather clear on that. There's one passage from that chapter, if I can find it quickly, I'll read from that, which talks about life on the reservation. While I was there, and I don't think it's changed very much, the unemployment rate on Standing Rock Indian Reservation is 79%. 79% unemployment rate. These are people who are really without hope, I think, in some ways. Alcohol is a terrible problem. And so these two pastors, two religious leaders, were trying to address it, each in their different way. Now, let me just read quickly. St. Paul's Episcopal Cemetery in South Dakota, about 35 miles south of Fort Yates, lies on a hill overlooking the village of Little Eagle. The barren, treeless landscape offers no relief from the hot sun, and temperatures well in excess of 100 degrees. Sweet clover, a yellowish wildflower, and the only vegetation in sight, covers the hillside and much of the cemetery. A low wire fence surrounds the burial ground. A simple wooden plank high over the gate identifies the cemetery on the one side, and on the other reads, "Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life." White, weathered crosses, most of them askew, pitched alternately by blistering heat and deadening frost, mark the graves of those who lie beneath the parched, cracked earth. Orly L. Little Dog, 1960 to 1981. Catherine Kills Crow, 1959 to 1975. John Carrion Jr., 1953 to 1972. Cornelius Bobtail Bear, 1957 to 1984. William Bobtail Bear, 1958 to 1985. Another graveyard on a nearby rise, the Elkhorn Hill Cemetery, tells a similar story about depredations of alcohol and the perils of youth on the reservation. Observers have long puzzled over the peculiar Indian vulnerability to liquor. Some posit a physiological weakness that leaves them susceptible, while others blame a lack of discipline. Sociologists cite a familiar litany of conditions: unemployment, boredom, a sense of powerlessness that leads to despair and then to the bottle. Father Goodhouse, while not dismissing these factors, believes that rampant alcoholism among the Indians arises from a fundamental confusion about who they are, a confusion born of cultural disintegration and this tension between the traditions of Indian culture and the demands of white civilization. To me, drinking and violence are caused by culture shock, he said, the result of an uncertain identity. Goodhouse wants to see the Sioux recover their heritage and traditions. And on this weekend, beneath a relentless July sun, the Sioux of Standing Rock Indian Reservation are trying to do just that. And then I talk about the Little Eagle powwow, which is taking place on one part of town, and then on the edge of town, John Bush and his congregation are resolutely separate and not participating in that powwow. Another person I talked to, and I'll probably close with this and invite your questions, was a filmmaker who lives in Des Moines, Iowa. His name is Donald Thompson, and his most famous films depict life on Earth during the apocalypse predicted in the book of Revelation. His most famous film is a film called A Thief in the Night, which is about the rapture, when the true believers, according to one interpretation of the book of Revelation, will be taken out of this world, and there'll be terrible tribulation, terrible perils that await those who are left behind. This is where the term comes from, in the Left Behind series of books, and now I guess a new movie's come out about this with Nicolas Cage. But this movie was produced in the early 1970s, released in 1972, My father's in the movie. I probably should be clear about that, but that's a whole other story. And this film has scared the bejesus out of evangelical adolescents for several decades now. And Don is, in many ways, a delightful guy. He really is, kind of brimming with enthusiasm and so forth. And Catherine is looking at me askance here, more than a little bit crazy. But he's unapologetic about this. He said rather famously when we were doing the PBS adaptation of this book, he said, "I'd rather have people scared into the kingdom of heaven than have them not show up at all." And he's very clear about that. So I'll end, at least for this part of it, by my breakfast with Donald Thompson 25 years after first writing about him in Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory here. Sorry, I should have noted this before. Sorry, I was confused. It's the afterword, not the epilogue. Pardon me. I met Donald Thompson for a Sunday morning breakfast in Des Moines, Iowa, 40 years after the release of A Thief in the Night. His signature motion picture that scared the bejesus out of a generation of evangelical adolescents. My former Sunday school teacher handed me a book, My Friend, Jesus, Me, and the Movies, billed as, quote, a biography of Donald W. Thompson as written by J. Howard Sloan. He paused. "I think you're in this book," Thompson said uncertainly. The book is studded with exclamations like, "God is so awesome," and "there's no such thing as a coincidence." The narrative strings together many anecdotes from Thompson's varied and illustrious career. Stock car driver, actor, radio personality, filmmaker, many of which I had heard before, some of them several times. But it also records his bouts with depression, which became so severe that he received shock treatments some years back. I had seen him during what was likely the manic phase that preceded his slide into depression, and was dimly aware of some rumors to the effect that he had been hospitalized. Still, it had been several years since I'd seen Thompson or even been in contact. Some time ago, he'd invited me to write his biography, and I considered the possibility, but I concluded that the portrait I'd written for Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory was probably as far as I wanted to go. Over breakfast, Thompson seemed slightly less ebullient than I'd remembered him from encounters over the years. I couldn't decide at the time if it was simply his age, 75, or the rumored shock treatments. Still, he is clearly a person of considerable energy, especially when he slips into his raconteur persona, although some of the dates and the stories have begun to blur. He still punctuates his speech with declarations like, "The Lord is good," and "I'm so grateful to him for opening doors and closing doors." He recounts conversations with Jesus as casually as some people would recall an exchange with a real estate agent or a clerk in the grocery store. "Jesus, what do you want me to do?" To which the Lord replies, "I want you to quit your job." In another exchange, the Almighty entertained Thompson's preferences for a new automobile. "Lord, I sure would like to have that Eldorado." Although any conversation with Don Thompson is an exercise in free association, pinballing from topic to topic, I learned that he no longer attends Westchester Evangelical Free Church, the congregation my father led from 1968 until 1979, because the current pastor, quote, preaches a political agenda. As a member of Westchester in the 1970s, Thompson had forged friendships with many of the people who helped him produce A Thief in the Night, which Time magazine once described as a church basement classic. Some of the church members invested financially in the shoestring production. Others helped logistically with production and distribution, and a few appeared as actors or extras in the film. In the course of the script writing and planning the production, Thompson frequently stopped by the pastor's study to seek counsel and encouragement from my father, who played the good preacher in A Thief in the Night. Thompson, in fact, credits my father with inspiring the idea. After hearing one of my father's many sermons about the end times, Thompson vowed, "I'm going to make a movie about that." With evident sincerity, he described my father as such a good pastor and a good friend. Despite his protestations to the contrary, Thompson remains bitter about Mark IV Productions, the entity that produced the film and several others, and which owns all the rights. I don't pretend to know the entire story, but Thompson claims that his erstwhile partner, Russell Doughton, unfairly, perhaps illegally, forced him out. That company's worth millions and I got nothing, Thompson told me, not a nickel. I'd heard variations of this account many, many times, but they were invariably followed by a declaration of forgiveness. This time, pointing to the book, Thompson said, I don't say anything about Russ because I've forgiven him. Later in the conversation, Thompson pointed in the direction of Mark IV offices just a few blocks away. They are so into money over there, he said, referring to Doughton, and added, with no apparent sympathy, after he screwed me, his house burned down. Still, Thompson says he derives satisfaction from the fact that, quote, 300 people a day come to Christ through seeing his films, many of them from viewing them online. It just breaks my heart to know that there are people who don't know Christ, he said. As we headed to the parking lot, I asked casually if he still lived on Shawnee Place, a question that triggered another free association. I had this thing one day where the Lord told me to go next door and tell my neighbors about Christ, he said. One guy just laughed at me, and the other got so mad, he still won't talk to me. I guess he thinks I'm one of those religious nuts. Thompson paused and headed for his car. He turned back, and a big grin suddenly enveloped his face. When the tribulation comes, Thompson said about his neighbor, he'll be singing a different tune. Questions? I'm looking at Kate here.
So you mentioned that you were advised not to write this.
Yes.
Clearly, it doesn't seem to have hurt your career. What was the reaction in the academic world to this book?
That's a really good question. I was when this book came out, and I want to be careful about this because I don't want to be too immodest. I think it is the first time, at least in my memory and during my career, when somebody has tried to combine ethnography, that is, talking to people, visiting people, with history. So there are a lot of, I didn't get into that, but there are a lot of historical digressions in the book. So and I think that it kind of weaves in fairly seamlessly into the narrative. So I think that was one of the things that the chair of the department said, don't do this. He couldn't quite imagine what this would look like. I think he feared it would be too popular and not a scholarly book. And in fact, my dissertation, which I revised for publication, was published 3 weeks before this came out. Had that been reversed, had this book come out first, even 3 weeks earlier, I think I might have had maybe a little bit more trouble. I think the dissertation actually kind of established my scholarly credentials, and then I was able to follow up with this. What happened with the book came out in 1989, and then I started getting inquiries from television people who wanted to make it into a documentary. And so in the early 90s, we did a 3-part documentary on this, based on this book. And that's the documentary that got me the Emmy nomination. Yes, please.
Would you say that coming back 25 years later, there's a rise in the power of evangelism in America or a decline? And do you think it's something we should fear or not?
Is there a rise or decline? Well, I'll take that one first. Recent polling data, and by that I mean within the last year or so it's not over a long enough stretch to know that this is a bigger trend. Recent polling data show that the influence, or at least the number of people or percentage of Americans willing to identify themselves as evangelical has been going down. I happen to think it's because of the rampant politicization of the movement which has taken place over the last 25 years. And people are just upset. I mean, even this Don Thompson saying, I don't go to this church anymore because the pastor is too political. I think a lot of evangelicals themselves feel that way. Should we fear them as a political, I assume you mean as a political entity? I think there's reason to fear them, yes. I think if you care about, frankly, if you care about the First Amendment, concerned about this group. It's not a monolithic group, and I want to be careful to reiterate that, but they have a great deal of political power. And I think to some degree they dissipated that political power in their embrace of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, but it's still a potent political force. To some degree, I think the Tea Party has kind of taken that over. And if you think about the Tea Party and the religious right as a Venn diagram, you know, they're not concentric circles. That is to say, not everybody in the religious right is part of the Tea Party or vice versa, but they are intersecting circles, which is to say that a lot of the religious right folks would be happy to identify themselves as Tea Party people and vice versa. You know, I'm not very good at these questions because I'm not a prognosticator, I'm a historian, but I am fearful, sure, because I think the politics they represent, frankly, are a betrayal of the New Testament, you know, to put it in the starkest terms, but also a betrayal of 19th century progressive evangelicalism, which really did care for those on the margins of society, working for the emancipation of slaves, working for equal rights for women, including voting rights, and that has been pretty much lost in current iterations of evangelical politics.
It gets so fuzzy because liberals like me, liberal Democrats, look at Obama.
Yeah.
For instance, Senator Feinstein, Senator Shaheen, all of whom are crazy fanatics in favor of NSA surveillance, from my viewpoint, cutting into the First Amendment, as you were mentioning. It's not all fundamentalists who are doing that. And the fundamentalist genius has been, I think, partly that they have wormed their way into the mainstream and into the parts of the Democratic Party that used to be responsible for a more leftist approach to politics. So we got, again, Feinsteins and so forth, having no trouble whatsoever with things that would have outraged a lot of liberals before, let's say 20 years ago, and they still outrage people like me. So I think the danger is not necessarily just from, let's say, Tea Party people, but from the fact that the people you're talking about, have wormed their ideology into also the former leftist or moderate wing of the Democratic Party.
I take your observation. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I take that observation. I think for one of the things that I've tried to do in some of my writing, at least, and certainly I think in this book, at least indirectly, is to say to evangelicals themselves, look at your history, look at your heritage, and if you do, you're going to act very differently in the political arena from the way you've been acting over the last several decades. In other words, trying to call evangelicals to their better selves and say, listen, this is not who you are historically. Historically, you've been, you've taken the part of those on the margins of society, and that we don't see much of that today in the political arena, I think. Yes, please.
I was interested in your comment about Hispanics.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talk on the news shows about what they want politically.
Yeah.
Immigration, one, and but my experience is with Hispanics in Texas who are, for the most part, Catholic. Mm-hmm. But I wondered what your experience with. I mean, are they taking that political agenda we hear about into an evangelical?
It's not a simple story, and the Latino evangelicals or Hispanic evangelicals I talk to don't fit easily into conventional political categories. That is, they tend to be anti-abortion folks, but certainly on other issues, including immigration, as you suggested, they have a very, very different view. And I think they are beginning to bring some evangelicals back to a more, at least centrist and maybe even leftist position on some issues, politically. For the final chapter, I went to a rally down in Washington, D.C., actually just 2 blocks from the Capitol, over immigration reform. And you talked to folks there and was described that. And then part of that whole afternoon was going to offices of members of Congress and the U.S. Senate. Actually, I went to Mike Lee's Senate office, the very, very conservative governor or senator from Utah, and was in on the conversation with him about these sorts of issues. And then I went to Chicago to visit one of the largest, in fact, it is the largest Assemblies of God congregation in Chicago, led by a man named Wilfredo de Jesus, who was on the cover of Time magazine as an example of a kind of the insurgent Latino evangelical population. And yes, most Latinos still would be Catholic, but the number or the percentage of those moving into evangelicalism is increasing quite significantly, and has been so over the last several years.
I keep hearing that they're going to have a huge, huge impact on elections coming up.
Yeah.
But, I mean, national elections.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're
Yep.
a huge vote.
Just have to
relative
get them
what
out to
they
the
were.
polls. that's part of the challenge. But yes, I think that's right. So, you know, the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is that if you're speaking specifically about Latino evangelicals, they're not going to fit neatly into existing political categories.
That's what I wondered about.
But I think that, you know, the general trend is away. Certainly, they're not marching lockstep with the religious right.
So, tell us about post-evangelicals.
Post him. There are a few. Actually, I started writing a book about that, post evangelicals. You know, I described the challenge of adolescence. Evangelicals grow up within evangelical households, and the struggle they have to claim their faith. And so the project was interviewing evangelicals at age 40 or age 50 and find out how they've kind of moved, where they've gone after they went through their adolescent struggles. What I found is that for the most part, those who grew up in evangelical or fundamentalist households either reject the faith altogether or they embrace it altogether. That is, many of them become as fundamentalist as their parents as adults. And many others, especially if they go to college, frankly, they reject it altogether. And I don't like either option. I think the real challenge for people who grow up within a certain tradition, and evangelicalism is not the only one. We can talk about others as well. I think the real challenge is trying to kind of sift through it as an adult and make it your own in ways that you can, rather than simply reject it out of hand. And that, in a sense, was what that chapter was about in this book, the Bible Camp chapter, telling people's stories and indirectly telling my own story in so doing. By the way, this challenge of passing faith one generation to the next, as I said, is not peculiar to evangelicals. I think the best example of this, and I refer to students to this all the time, is Chaim Potok's novel *The Chosen*, which I'm sure you have here, probably in the library. It's a wonderful, wonderful story about Danny Saunders, who grows up in a Hasidic household. His father is the Rebbe of that particular Hasidic group, and Danny Saunders has all the intellectual knowledge. He can, at the drop of a hat, recite these recondite passages from the Torah and so forth, and all these ancient authorities, but he can't grasp the faith for himself. He just can't do it. So I won't tell you how the novel ends, you have to read it yourself. But it's a wonderful example of that challenge of passing the faith from one generation to the Puritans, another example. The Puritans came over in the 17th century. The founding generation made this heroic Atlantic crossing to carve a godly commonwealth out of the howling wilderness of Massachusetts. Second generation comes along, and part of the requirement for church membership is to stand up in the meeting house and give an account of your own spiritual journey. Well, how can you begin to compare with that, the people who are sitting in front of you, who are passing judgment on your spiritual condition? And so what happens is that you have the falling away of the second generation, leads to the halfway covenant of 1662, and eventually the disintegration of the whole Puritan experiment, because you can't, the generational problem was just too large. It's very difficult, I think. It's very difficult. And evangelicals, as much as anybody, I mean, really face this.
Do you think the evangelicals are responsible for the split of the Episcopal Church?
For the split of the Episcopal Church? I'll repeat that so it gives me a chance to think about the question. Do I think evangelicals are responsible for the
Because
split
there
of
are a
the
lot of
Episcopal Church?
There were a lot of Episcopal evangelicals in Virginia.
Yeah, Virginia, right, and then South Carolina is crazy too. I hadn't really thought to formulate it that way, but I'm sure that's part of the influence. Part of the influence. I wish I could just sit down and talk to those people. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? And is this a mountain worth dying on? Is what I asked them, but nobody asked me to talk to them. But I think there's a big part of that. And getting back to the issue with evangelicals, adolescents, a lot of them, for various reasons, made this kind of migration from evangelicalism to the Episcopal Church. Some have gone further to the Catholic Church or even to Orthodoxy. But my general observation is that they're still fundamentalists, even if they're fundamentalists Greek Orthodox. They're still fundamentalists. And so I think that would be the source of a lot of the unrest within the Episcopal Church, because of the fundamentalist element there.
See, I think of the fundamentalists as using, for instance, they're creationists.
Yeah,
And
the
so forth. And evangelicals are not necessarily creationists. As a matter of fact, most of the ones I know are not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think it is important to remember there is a distinction between fundamentalist and evangelical. I used to say especially when he was active, that an evangelical is anybody who likes Billy Graham. And Graham was. I mean, he was not a fundamentalist. I mean, he was a lot of things, and I'm not uncritical of Graham, but he was not a fundamentalist. He was not a separatist. He was not a sectarian. And that was, I think, to his great credit. So that does mark him apart from the fundamentalist. But creationism is another dividing issue. I did a documentary on that too, by the way.
I did too. And on Billy Graham.
And on Billy Graham. I think I mentioned that. Dean?
Among my liberal friends, or among liberals in general, I think there's a lot of criticism of these people
Yep.
as intolerant and they lack a sense of humor and so forth. And I went to a church, this is just making it totally personal, for a year or two in Berlin, Germany, Baptist church, more or less fundamentalist, evangelical in its direction. Great people. And that's one thing that convinced me.
That's one of the reasons I wrote this book. There are wonderful people.
They actually believe a lot of what they say. Like the church and the congregation are responsible for each other, and so forth and so on. And I've been in politically liberal and more establishment congregations where absolutely none of that obtains. Right? That they say they believe all the right things. Right? So it's interesting. I just wondered what your perspective is.
No, absolutely right. And like I said, that's part. I mean, if you read this book, you'll meet a lot of very interesting and sympathetic characters. A few who are not too, but you will. The other point I want to make too, because since politics has come up in several of the questions, there is a progressive evangelical group. There is a strain of that. Probably the best known example would be Jim Wallace at Sojourners Magazine. Would be probably Exhibit A. Tony Campolo is another name that some people would know. Shane Claiborne, who was one of Tony's students, who is really doing some interesting stuff in the inner city of Philadelphia. I mean, he's essentially an evangelical monastic, an evangelical monk, and he is a rock star on evangelical campuses. He travels to visit Wheaton College and places like that, and the students just go crazy for him because he's trying to live as Jesus told his followers to live, to care for those who are less fortunate, to live among the poor and so forth, to be peacemakers and so forth. So there is a progressive evangelical wing. Politically, Mark Hatfield, some of you remember that name, U.S. Senator from Oregon, was very much in that tradition. Jimmy Carter, that's looping back to the other book, I think is clearly in that tradition. So there is a wing of evangelicalism called progressive evangelicalism that is very active. Problem is it doesn't have the media exposure that the more right-wing folks have. And it gives gives people a skewed perspective of what evangelicalism is. But there is certainly progressive evangelicals are very active as well. And I think probably increasing in their influence. Well, thank you.